Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 39, The History of China, Part 2. So today's drink of choice is Qingdao. Qingdao is a Chinese beer, and actually, according to one article I found, is the third most drunken beer in the world. Its history actually ties very nicely with where we were last time, with European powers carving out more and more of China at the end of the 19th century. It was founded in 1903 by German and British colonists in the German concession in the city of Qingdao. The company since then has had many twists and turns, which I'll try to make note of throughout the episode. The beer itself is a lager similar to other kind of German lager beers. It's very smooth with a nice hoppy, almost like peachy flavor. Overall, it's a very good beer. I enjoy it. It's light, but it still has a taste. I enjoyed it, and if you like a lager, you'll probably like it as well. So we can actually just get right into the history, since I've already done the country profile last episode. Last time we left China at the end of the 19th century, with European powers controlling more and more of the country. I was actually going to do an unscripted episode on the Boxer Uprising, while also talking about a book I read in college, but the unscripted nature of it made it very, very rambly. So for now, I've just decided to shelve it. But for the short version of the Boxer Uprising, it was a rebellion in northern China with a secret society known as the Boxers targeting Chinese Christians, missionaries, and any foreigners they could find. The Boxers, aided by the Qing court, besieged in Beijing several foreign diplomats, missionaries, and soldiers, along with several thousand Chinese Christians in the international quarter of the city for almost 2 months. However, a coalition of European powers, along with America and Japan, all sent an expeditionary force into Beijing, crushing the Boxers and ending the uprising. This would effectively kill any chance for the Qing to make a comeback. They were thoroughly humiliated, forced to pay reparations to the victorious armies, and they were forced to cede territory to the Russians and the Japanese. Before we get to the fall of the Qing dynasty, there are two important developments going on that we should touch up on. First off, secret societies became far more common in the dying days of the Qing. Secret societies or underground rebel groups appearing at the end of a Chinese dynasty was quite common, as groups like the Yellow Turbans in the Han Dynasty show that back over 1,000 years, these type of groups were operating in the country. The Boxers were just one of many secret societies plotting the downfall of the Qing, engaging in either revolt or agitation. However, notably due to contact with Europe and limited industrialization, new kinds of secret societies were starting to emerge, influenced more and more by European ideas and thinking, although they were often with their own Chinese interpretation. Another important development would be the large Chinese diaspora that would establish itself throughout the world. I've talked about the Chinese diaspora in my Australia, Brazil, Brunei, Cambodia, and Canada episodes. But Chinese people would move throughout the world, fleeing worsening conditions in China and pulled in by the promise of money in far-off lands. Many Chinese immigrants would sadly not get to experience much material increase, as racist labor laws in places like America devalued their labor, making them work for pennies, often in tough working conditions. However, this Chinese diaspora would come into more and more contact with the outside world, leading to those Chinese to view the Qing state through a new perspective. This would result in 1894 in Honolulu, Hawaii, the Revived China Society to be formed. The society was headed by Sun Yat-sen. He promoted his ideology, the three principles of the people, or nationalism, democracy, and socialism. These philosophies, however, don't exactly mean these three things. Nationalism is generally seen to mean wanting China to stand on its own, democracy meaning it wants to remove the Qing and introduce a type of republican system, and socialism meaning it wants to introduce a progressive welfare state. Sun Yat-sen would begin to find a support base among a variety of groups, but primarily the educated upper classes. The Revived China Society would merge with other secret societies and anti-Qing groups, and eventually would form the Kuomintang, or KMT. The KMT would in later years also be known as the Nationalist. The Nationalists and other anti-Qing forces would in 1911 defeat the Qing in the Xinhai Revolution. Parts of the Qing military sympathetic towards the Nationalists would revolt, leading to widespread unrest throughout China. The Qing tried to stop the uprising by sending their top general, Yuan to crush the rebels. However, after only a couple weeks of fighting, Yuan decided to negotiate with the rebels. On February 12, 1912, the Qing emperor, a child named Puyi, abdicated the throne, and the Republic of China was established, ending the Chinese imperial period after 2,000 years of ruling the country. While centuries of imperial rule was over, China wasn't by any stretch a democracy. Yuan became the president of this new republic, and when elections saw the nationalists win the majority of the seats, the election was overturned. Important nationalist leaders were killed, and Sun Yat-sen was forced into exile. Yuan quickly took to patronage to win political support, giving political allies important roles in the government, including as governors of China's provinces. Yuan even declared himself emperor in 1915, leading to the short-lived Empire of China. This was met with protest, and governors in southwest China began revolting, leading Yuan to abdicate, and he died shortly thereafter in 1916. China would be involved in World War I. In 1916, China declared war on Germany. China wouldn't send any troops to fight the Germans, but they would send thousands of Chinese laborers to help the Allied war effort, moving supplies, building fortifications, and generally being a source of labor. Several hundred to even 20,000 Chinese laborers would die from either shellfire or, more commonly, disease, as they were often put under tough working conditions. While China had hoped that this contribution might have given the Chinese more respect on the world stage and some concessions, the Chinese laborers ended the war mostly thankless and with little to show for it. Also in World War I, Japan would invade several small German concessions and colonies in China. In 1914, Japanese forces would take the German colony of Qingdao. Despite the Chinese asking for the city to be returned to Chinese hands, Qingdao would remain with Japan after the war. This, along with the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and Japan asking for more and more control over China's economy in the 1910s, shows that China is increasingly becoming more and more involved in China, trying to gain more and more control over the country. Also, the beer company I mentioned at the start would fall into the hands of Japanese businessmen. After the death of Yuan, China entered the Warlord period. Many of Yuan's ex-allies and provincial governors all founded their own mini-states all over China. While the government in Beijing claimed control over the entire country, by the early 1920s, they effectively only had the area around Beijing and north into Manchuria. Rival warlords fought each other, along with the remnants of the anti-Qing secret societies, bandits, and Qing loyalists, along with the nationalists who established a base in the south. But another group was starting to emerge on the scene. Chinese leftists had been active in the country since the dying days of the Qing. With the failure of China after World War I to gain more prominence on the world stage, a group of Chinese students protested outside the former imperial palace, Tiananmen Square, in 1919. This would evolve into the May 4th movement, with students, workers, and academics all protesting China being continually subjugated by stronger neighbors and colonial powers, along with having a deep-seated distrust of traditional literature and social teachings. Initially, many of these proto-leftist groups and movements were reformist or anarchist, but after the Russian Revolution, many began embracing communist and Marxist thought. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, would be formed. While initially quite small and mostly relegated to urban cities, they would grow over the years. A big thing helping the Chinese communists would be the Soviet Union. The Soviets' goals in China were both to build a revolutionary state to spread communism across the world and gain a new ally in the fight against capitalism, and also create a buffer between them and the Japanese, who, as mentioned earlier, were expanding across East Asia. The Soviets sent advisors to aid the communists, giving them advice on how to build the party, and also teaching the Chinese communists on military tactics, which overall helped them expand and grow as a fighting force. The Soviets backing the CCP is not surprising since both are communist, but the Soviets actually backed the nationalists, something that is very strange when you think about how the KMT is looked at today as a party for the conservative right. However, the KMT pre-50s was divided between two separate wings. One branch, which leaned more into Sun Yat-sen's idea for a socialist or at least progressive Chinese state, and another which leaned more into nationalism that was right-wing. This more left-wing branch was friendly with the Soviets. The Soviets also followed a Marxist interpretation of history, believing a nationalist/liberal government would have to reform China, which would then allow for the urban proletariat to rise up in the future. So in the early to mid-20s, both the CCP and the KMT were allies. As the nationalists grew more and more powerful, they planned to retake the country from the warlords. Sun Yat-sen would die in 1925 from cancer and would be succeeded by one of his military commanders, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang in 1925 led the Northern Expedition, going north and with the aid of the CCP, Soviet advisors, friendly warlords, and criminal gangs, would take Beijing and, for the most part, control all of China. While Tibet and Mongolia had broken away in the aftermath of the Xinhai Revolution, and warlords still effectively controlled many areas in the north, west, and southwest, the nationalists were finally able to credibly call themselves the rulers of China, setting up a government in Nanjing. But as soon as the nationalists took control, they turned on the CCP. Tension had always existed between the two, since their ideologies were only similar in comparison to the conservative warlords who dominated the country beforehand. Chiang also being a part of the right-wing faction of the KMT, and being willing to ally with those conservative warlords who many in the KMT and CCP saw as holding China back, also led to tension. In 1927, the KMT, with the help of Chinese criminal gangs, began killing hundreds of Chinese communist and labor union members in Shanghai in the Shanghai Massacre. This led to a break between the communists and the nationalists and the start of the Chinese Civil War. Initially, the communists attempted to stage mass revolts across the country, hoping to overthrow the KMT in a popular uprising. However, the nationalists had a much larger army, and the communists, despite Soviet help, remained small. The KMT quickly cracked down on them, crushing any communist resistance they found, and nationalist forces quickly took to killing any they suspected might be communist, with women having bobbed hair being enough to be executed. The CCP quickly were forced to flee west, setting up a base in Jiangxi province. While they did manage to gain support in the area, continued nationalist assaults and infighting amongst themselves led the CCP to abandon its base in the region and flee north, in what has been known as a Long March in 1934. Tens of thousands of communists fled, marching 6,000 miles north, suffering mass casualties. However, by 1935, they managed to set up a new base of operations in Shaanxi province. While they had lost many members, they did survive, managed to enter into a new region where it was harder for the KMT to assault them, and allowed one CCP military officer, Mao Zedong, to rise through the ranks. I mentioned nationalists accusing women with bobbed hair of being communist, so it's worth taking some time and discussing the advancements of women's rights during this time period. With new ideas like liberalism, nationalism, and Marxism being introduced, it's not a surprise that feminism, particularly the Western form of the movement, began taking hold, particularly among educated urban women. During the dying days of the Qing, schools for women began being built, and more opportunities began to be opened up for women in urban areas. Many early Chinese feminists were concerned about stuff such as ending foot binding, legalizing divorce, and promoting legal equality, all of which were achieved by the 1930s. Women were more and more being seen as actors and players in politics, and not just housewives, with women getting involved in the KMT and CCP. However, importantly, these changes mostly affected just urban women. Out in the countryside, where the majority of the population was located, these changes were often ignored or barely noticed. While the KMT were at first aided by the Soviets, they, after the Shanghai Massacre, turned more to Europe for influence and aid. The nationalists, while raging on foreign influence, also encouraged Western advisors to help them build up their government. The nationalists attempted to modernize China, building up manufacturing and schools, electricity was introduced, and Western fashion and culture became more popular and common. Old Qing laws were reformed, and Sun Yat-sen's vision of a China not bounded by the constraints of a repressive Qing seemed to flourish. However, the nationalists, while certainly the rulers of China, didn't actually rule all of China. They shared power, especially outside the major urban cities on the East Coast with warlords, who cared very little about the KMT's three principles of the people. So effectively, the nationalist reforms weren't actually felt by the majority of the population, and the nationalists increasingly became focused solely on China's cities. The nationalists using strongmen points to the fact that they aren't really focused on things like democracy or listening to the people. The KMT actually during the 30s were growing increasingly close with Nazi Germany, who helped inspire the KMT to create the Blue Shirts, a part fascist paramilitary, part secret police who would target any who opposed the nationalist rule. Corruption would also plague the nationalist government. Meanwhile, the communists in Shaanxi were taking a very different path. While initially the communists were like the nationalists, a mostly urban organization, years of fighting in the countryside had endeared them to the rural peasants. While Marxist theory generally argued the revolution would come from the urban worker/proletariat, Chinese communists began arguing it was instead the rural peasants who had the revolutionary potential. These beliefs were held perhaps most dearly by Mao and his allies in the party. The communists in Shaanxi began implementing their own slow land reform, often not being outright antagonistic towards the rich in the countryside, by slowly redistributing the wealth and land via taxes. They also, unlike many of the other factions fighting in China, didn't resort to stealing harvests from the peasants and often tried to listen to them via meetings where people could talk about politics. The Cambridge Illustrated History notes that a popular saying during the time was, quote, "Under the nationalists, too many taxes. Under the communists, too many meetings," unquote. Mao also got to work shoring up his support in the party, crushing any who opposed him with the party and attempting to humiliate any who spoke out against him. Japan, as stated previously, were very involved in China, and the 20s and 30s saw even more incursions into China. In 1932, they invaded Manchuria. This led to a tense 5 years until the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where nationalist and Japanese forces fought just north of Beijing. This led to the Second Sino-Japanese War, as Japanese troops began a fully fledged military campaign to conquer all of China. In the initial years of the war, the Japanese were very successful, taking large parts of East China and Inner Mongolia, including Beijing and Nanjing. When Japanese troops entered into Nanjing, Japanese troops began killing or sexually assaulting mass numbers of Chinese civilians. Probably some of the most horrific events of World War II took place in Nanjing in December of 1937, as tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of Chinese were killed, and at least 20,000 Chinese women were raped, in what became known as the Rape of Nanjing. The Japanese were ultimately slowed down in 1938 when the nationalists intentionally flooded the Yellow River, giving the nationalists time to set up a base of operations in Chongqing. The Japanese were aided in their occupation of China by several different collaborators. By 1940, 3 different Chinese-based states aided the Japanese. In Nanjing, the Wang Jingwei government was set up. Wang Jingwei, a member of the KMT, broke with the party and set up his own friendly pro-Japanese government under the ideology of Pan-Asianism. In Inner Mongolia, the government of Manzhong was set up, headed by a Mongol noble whose father was a Qing-era official. Finally, in Manchuria, the state of Manchukuo was set up, headed by, surprisingly, the last Qing emperor, Puyi, and also supported by local fascists in the area. While the Japanese did have their allies in China, for the most part these states were deeply unpopular with the average Chinese person. The fact that these states were largely propped up by a foreign invading army, used de facto slave labor, forced women into being comfort women, and human experimentation all meant that the Japanese collaborator states were widely hated. Resistance groups emerged throughout the occupied territories. In the north in particular, the communists managed to form an effective alliance of local rebels, ex-bandits, the last remnants of the anti-Qing secret societies, Korean nationalists, along with local communists to fight the Japanese. The Chinese tried to fight back and retake land from the Japanese, but were hampered by their poor industry. The land the nationalists held by 1939 was pretty much all the parts of China that were the least industrialized. While supplies from the Soviets and then later Americans in 1941 did help the Chinese out, they didn't have the equipment to launch a full reconquest of their stolen land. The Chinese were able to launch several successful military campaigns, but they were often met with limited success or pushed back. The nationalists and communists were briefly allied together, but fighting between the two led them to develop a cold relationship by war's end. The Japanese wouldn't be defeated until 1945, as American forces moved across the Pacific and the Soviets invaded Manchuria in August of that year. By war's end, somewhere around 20 million Chinese would be dead. After the war, China was divided between the communist-controlled Manchuria and the nationalists who controlled pretty much everywhere else. The nationalists got back to their old ways, leading by corruption and authoritarianism, and a growing sense of dissent began to creep in. Inflation rising post-war also hurt the nationalists. Going back to our favorite beer, Qingdao, after the war it was taken from the Japanese and given to the Su family, who seemed to have been affiliated with the KMT. It wasn't long after the end of World War II when the Chinese Civil War would flare up again. The Chinese nationalists on paper appeared stronger, with a larger army, more land, and aided by the Western powers. However, the communists did receive the backing of the Soviet Union, who provided them with weapons and were much more popular among the rural population. Starting in mid-1946, the nationalists did make some limited successes, but quickly the communists reversed much of this and were able to take large chunks of the country. Nationalist resistance began to collapse, and by 1949, the nationalists had lost all their territory on mainland China. KMT-aligned fighters would wage a guerrilla war in parts of the country until the 60s, but effectively the war was over by 1950. When the CCP invaded and took the island of Hainan, the KMT would be relegated to just the island of Taiwan and some small outlying islands around it. Also in 1951, the Chinese would retake Tibet. The communists were aided in their fight against the nationalists by a wide variety of groups, most notably the remnants of the left-wing faction of the KMT. The left-wing faction of the KMT, along with 7 other political organizations, would go on to form the United Front. This front is interesting because they serve as allies and almost interest groups to the CCP, helping people from certain social classes get into government. I made an episode about a year and a half ago talking about these other parties that operate in China. The audio quality is meh. And I go into a bit of a weird sidetrack on propaganda and China, but overall, I think it's good if you want to learn more about the other legal parties of China. I'll put a link to it in the description. Mao had started off as a poor peasant farmer and now had become the head of the new People's Republic of China. First off, the government began nationalizing and taking control of the economy. One of these companies that was nationalized would, of course, be our favorite beer brand, Qingdao. Slowly, businesses were taken over by the state, either via force or by public humiliation in the Five Antis campaign, as business owners were made to confess to corruption or other crimes, real or imagined. Those affiliated with the nationalists were particularly targeted, and many ex-CAM team members were driven out of public life. Land reform took place as formerly rich landowners had their land redistributed to poorer peasants. Many hundreds of thousands of Chinese joined the CCP, giving them access to greater influence in their communities and rose through the ranks in this new Chinese system. The poor and women in particular saw their political capital grow more and more, and saw social mobility like never before. The communists further expanded industrialization as more factories were built throughout the country. Mao hoped to expand industry even further in the Great Leap Forward. In the late 50s, Chinese peasants were encouraged to collectivize their land and work hard to turn the country into an industrial powerhouse. Backyard steel furnaces were built with the average worker encouraged to make their own steel. However, very few actually knew how to properly refine steel from these backyard furnaces, so they often ended up as a waste. As more and more energy was devoted to industrialize and power the nation, less energy was used to tend to the farms. Worst, many local government officials overreported their agricultural success. So many parts of the country began to enter into famine at the same time they were reporting back to Mao that they were never better. Many attempted to flee, but population registration efforts that began in 1955 forced many to stick to the land, and at best, struggled to find work in new areas they moved to, which ultimately ended up contributing to rural poverty. The death toll seems somewhat unclear, but it's believed millions were dead by the time the Great Leap Forward was over in 1962. There were some positives to the Great Leap Forward, such as an increase in women's employment, productivity would increase, and many infrastructure projects were complete, but due to political pressure, they were often completed hastily. China's first nuclear weapons would also be developed during this time. Maoist China notably had many of these major changes occur under a very moralist framework. Even in the early days of land reform, land was redistributed in a very moralist manner, with land being taken from the rich not just because they had more land, but also because that specific rich person was seen as having a moral failing. So, if a person was seen in a village as a good person, they could avoid the brunt of redistribution, or if they were seen as a bad person, they could suffer extra for their misdeeds. The Cambridge Illustrated History notes this led to rivals within villages to target each other, seeking to punish their enemies and reward their friends. While China was on paper united under the Chinese Communist Party, in reality, China was de facto divided between many different factions within the party, or even just within the local villages. Mao in the late 50s also began to use his power to crack down on academics who he viewed as counter-revolutionary, since academics were historically Confucian scholars. And in the 100 Flowers of Thought campaign, asked for criticism of the party, and then promptly punished those who criticized the party. In 1966, Mao began the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution saw often young Communist Party members form Red Guard units to try and wipe out the remnants of anti-revolutionary and rightist thought in the country. Red Guards would beat and publicly humiliate intellectuals, business owners, landlords, elites, religious priests, or just those whose families once had someone that belonged to one of these groups. Old Chinese historical monuments were often vandalized for being reactionary or otherwise anti-revolutionary. Party elites also began to be targeted for being corrupt or voicing dissent of Mao. Slowly, the Red Guards began to turn on each other, accusing other factions of not being sufficiently loyal to Mao, coming from bad class backgrounds, or just otherwise competition with each other. It reached such a fever pitch, at points the Cultural Revolution almost resembled a civil war in some cases, such as Wuhan in 1967, as rival groups of Red Guards assisted by the Chinese army fought each other. During this time, China also began to experience a strange geopolitical shift. Not surprisingly, the People's Republic of China, which was created with Soviet assistance, was friendly with the Soviets. Initially, both the Soviets and the Chinese worked closely with each other, with Soviet advisors helping the Chinese develop nuclear technology and industrialize, as the Chinese provided the Soviets with food exports. However, after the death of Stalin in 1953, the Soviets took a more reformist path towards communism, which clashed with Mao's more hardline stance. Tension over the Soviet-Chinese border and the unequal nature of initial Soviet-Chinese relations also created conflict. By the early 60s, the PRC and the USSR were more or less geopolitical rivals, with a small border conflict in Manchuria, and the Soviets and Chinese tending to fund rivaling leftist movements throughout the world, such as Cambodia, where in the 80s the Chinese funded the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, while the Soviets backed the Vietnamese-backed Cambodian government. This ironically led the more devoutly communist state, the PRC, to begin to align itself with the Americans, the head of the capitalist world in the early 70s, for a better economic and geopolitical position. By the early 70s, Mao was an old man, and more of the power he held was being given to his wife and several other CCP leaders in a group known as the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four, while initially quite powerful, due to their close proximity to Mao, developed a lot of enemies. Eventually, Mao died of old age in 1976. This created a power struggle leading to the Gang of Four being disposed and the end of the Cultural Revolution. While an ally of Mao, Hua Guothang, would take control for several more years, the 80s saw Maoism lose ground in China, and the CCP moved towards a more reformist direction. The Cultural Revolution's death toll is unclear, but it seems to be somewhere around 1 million. It left China in an awkward position in the world, emerging as a powerful state that couldn't be ignored, but also still with massive problems and without the industrial capacity as other strong states around the world. The state and society was also incredibly divided due to the events of the Cultural Revolution, as many in urban areas had been humiliated or did the humiliating themselves, creating a sense of underlying tension and lost opportunity. Yet, interestingly, despite the death and turmoil of this period, the Chinese population actually grew due to improvements in healthcare, and in just a few short years, 1 billion people would live in China. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping would take power in China, and turn China towards this more modern mixed economic model. Deng liberalized much of the economy, opening up China to foreign investment, began privatizing certain parts of certain industries, encouraged entrepreneurship and side businesses, and it became easier to move around the country. Welfare was cut, and state companies that weren't privatized were often downsized. As new foreign companies set up shop in China, many began using China as a source of cheap labor. There's the very common joke that everything you own is made in China, due to the fact that China is one of the number one sources for cheap labor abroad, one of the largest exporters of goods in the world, and an economic powerhouse. While many men found work in new private companies, many women actually were out of work due to state companies downsizing, and women were often the first to be fired. China's large population also began to concern the Chinese state, who feared they might not have enough resources to care for such a large population. So, they implemented the one-child policy, encouraging parents to have just one child to curb the population rate. Deng also tried to mend ties with the Soviets while still being friendly with America. These reforms, while they were popular among some of the population, there also was discontent with both the rate of reform and the reforms themselves. As the market offered wealth to many, government officials began using their connections to help themselves get rich. This growing level of corruption, along with the less repressive attitude of the Cultural Revolution ending, led more and more Chinese students and activists to voice their frustrations with the new system. In April of 1989, Chinese students, workers, and various political groups all began protesting the new system in Tiananmen Square, with most calling for reform towards a more open system and an end to corruption. Deng and other party officials, fearing the protests could spill out like the other pro-democracy protests in Eastern Europe happening at the same time and lead to the end of the CCP, cracked down on the protesters. Tanks were sent in June, with hundreds killed and thousands arrested. Many CCP officials who had voiced support for the protest, or even just democratic reform, were also imprisoned as Deng sought to prevent the end of the PRC with force. This has helped lead to the international image that China under the CCP is an authoritarian state that will brutally crack down on any dissent it sees. Deng would manage to prevent the CCP from losing its influence, but it cost Deng his role as head of state. By 1992, Deng was no longer the main leader of China, and Jiang Zemin came into that job. Jiang followed in many of Deng's footsteps, continuing the liberalization of the economy and improving infrastructure and China's industrial output. Environmental problems that began under Deng continued under Jiang's rule, as factory smoke began to clog up Beijing's air, until today, where there are some days where you can't go outside due to all the dangerous particles in the air. It would be under Jiang when Macau and Hong Kong would be given back to the PRC, with their own special autonomous powers. Jiang's rule would also see Qingdao privatized, with a private company since the 90s manufacturing the beer. Jiang would step down in 2002 and be replaced by Hu Jintao, and he also wouldn't stray too far from Jiang and Ding, continuing to promote China as a manufacturing powerhouse, growing the economy, and building on public infrastructure. Hu would also, like his predecessors, have a government which was plagued by corruption. As I talked about earlier, as China liberalized more and more, the party also grew more distant and cold towards the average Chinese person. The CCP, according to one article I found, Ideology in the Xi Jinping Era, in the Journal of Chinese Political Science, was on paper a Marxist-Leninist party, yet presided over, quote, one of the greatest creations of national wealth the world has ever seen, unquote. Important to note that Chinese leaders often have their own ideology based around them. So Mao had Maoism, Deng had Dengism, and Jiang had the three represents. Who would have scientific development, which argued for a technocratic government that emphasized trying to both continue China's path towards a more developed and integrated economy, while also trying to help benefit the average Chinese individual more. The party was seen as something that should be more in the background and not at the forefront. This was all seen as an attempt to stop the rising perception of corruption in China. In 2012, a new Chinese leader would come to take power, and while he wouldn't fundamentally upend the status quo, he would change it significantly. Xi Jinping was elected as General Secretary of the CCP and began promoting his ideology of the Chinese Dream. The Chinese Dream was a reaction to the previous years of the party appealing cold and distant. It promoted the Chinese to see themselves living in a better future, and a future that promised greater opportunities and prosperity to the Chinese people. The party in Xi's China was supposed to focus on improving living standards first and foremost, and restore pride to China and pride of the CCP. The vocabulary of Xi is one that often tries to use old terms from Qing-era reformers, as well as Chinese interpretations of words promoted by liberal democracies, such as minju, or democracy, or a system that is not controlled by foreign powers. It is a very populist and nationalistic message. Xi and his allies want China to see itself as a nation that is working towards a better society and as a major player in the world. So how does this look in practice? Well, Xi's China has seen private companies continue to grow, but also with the state taking a more active role in the economy. GDP growth is not the sole goal of the CCP, but stuff like the eradication of poverty and growing the Chinese middle class are seen as goals for China. The one-child policy has been reversed, and the population has increased, albeit at a much slower rate than in the mid-20th century. Xi's power itself has also increased, as he has increased his constitutional powers while cracking down on both corruption and dissent from within the CCP towards him and his allies. Xi's China overall is a powerful player in the world, and one that can't be ignored. Now, there's a lot I could talk about in regards to the living standards in China, issues China is facing, events of the past 10 years, and different movements, groups, and trends all taking place in China. However, this episode is already fairly long, so I'll just mention opposition in China, ethnic groups and regionalism, and Chinese foreign policy before I end the episode. First off, China is a state that doesn't allow organized opposition to operate in the country. Those that do try to organize can be arrested. Despite this, political opposition is very much alive and well in China, and over the years, many different protest movements have popped up. In 2011, there was a wave of protest in China, partially inspired by the Arab Spring, with some protesters calling for democracy, while others protested environmental concerns, corruption, and ethnic unrest. The latest large protest was back in 2022, with protests over China's strict zero-COVID policy. There does seem to be a decent chunk of the population who are dissatisfied with the state of affairs of the country, but mapping out how many people believe this is unclear. Underground liberal and Maoist groups do operate, but they seem to be largely irrelevant. But perhaps a more powerful opposition force is the various separatist groups in China. While the PRC has made it a goal to promote China as a multi-ethnic society and give minority groups greater autonomy at the local level, ethnic tension has existed in China, well, seemingly since the days of the 16 kingdoms of the 5 barbarians. Very briefly, I'll run through the 4 seemingly largest and most influential separatist groups in China. Xinjiang has recently received a lot of attention due to China's policy of forced assimilation of the Uyghur population, with several Western states accusing China of committing a genocide. This, along with tension between the Uyghurs and newer Han migrants, have led to riots, bombings, and several separatist forces fighting for an independent East Turkestan. This out of all the separatist movements seems to be the biggest one due to the Uyghurs' large population and several large independent organizations, such as the Turkestan Islamist Party, although they tend to spend most of their time fighting other governments in Afghanistan and Syria. Tibet also has a large independence movement like Xinjiang, owing to the fact that both regions are the only regions that don't have a Han majority in them. Tibet's history with China has been long and complicated, but many Tibetan activists have argued that Tibet has always been independent and that China is cracking down on religious freedom in the region. While the Tibetan independence movement was quite large in the 50s, once America normalized relations with China in the 70s, it seems to have died down somewhat. Inner Mongolian independence movements also exist, but because the Mongols aren't a majority of the region, their independence movement is much smaller. Finally, there is an independence movement in Hong Kong, which due to China's crackdown of pro-democracy groups in the city, may be growing, but this seems like something that is supported more online than actually in person. Now let's look at China's position in the world. Part of Xi's Chinese dream was asserting China's role as a superpower on the world stage. Since the mid-2010s, America and China have become more and more hostile towards each other. With a de facto Cold War between the two states, both sides have seen a military buildup in the region and a trade war since Donald Trump's presidency. China has sought to increase its influence via its Belt and Road Initiative, where Chinese engineers help build infrastructure projects throughout Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe to increase China's soft power. This has mostly been successful, as China has grown its presence on the world stage, albeit with backlash from the West and accusations that the infrastructure projects are often done to help Chinese companies more easily extract resources and not actually help these countries develop. China has also come to have an increasingly more antagonistic relationship with many of its neighbors. It, however, does actually maintain relatively good relations with Pakistan and Myanmar and even Russia, albeit with the seeds of future conflict currently present. But back to the geopolitical drama. China and India have clashed over its border in Kashmir and Arunachal Pradesh, with border guards coming to blows at several points. As part of this new Cold War, China has also grown more hostile towards America's allies of South Korea and Japan, with Japan's role in World War II also helping drive tension between the two. Finally, in the South China Sea, China has tried to assert its control over the sea, which it disputes with 6 other states: Brunei, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia among them. So to end, why does China exist? While the current Chinese state has existed for less than a century, Chinese civilization has existed for thousands of years. The Yellow and Yangtze rivers helped create the farming conditions that led people to develop agriculture, which led to the creation of the first Chinese states. These Chinese states then built themselves up, expanding the Chinese state, influencing Chinese society, and leading China to where it is today. While China was conquered and subjugated at several points, its large population and size meant that it was impossible to fully colonize them, and instead many of its invaders themselves became Sinicized. The current PRC was created as a reaction against Western imperialism and the incompetence of the KMT, and has managed to survive due to the CCP being able to adapt to changing conditions around it. While Chinese history tells us that China is always changing and evolving, and new political conditions could one day spell the end of the current order of China, China will likely always exist in some form or another. Up next, we will talk about a state I didn't mention that is also playing its role in the South China Sea's dispute, and that I have been avoiding mentioning throughout much of the episode. Next, we will talk about Taiwan. Prepare for the birthplace of the Austronesian language family, various colonial enterprises, the KMT retreat and rule, and its current predicament as officially the Republic of China. So that will now end today's episode. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I know I didn't cover everything with modern Chinese history, but I hope it was at least sufficient. There really is so much, especially in regards to modern Chinese history, that I could have talked about, but I just decided for the sake of brevity, I would keep it maybe not short, but on the shorter side. But actually up next, I will take a little bit of a break from East Asia. I'll instead talk about German political parties, go back to political party episodes for a little bit, and then I will go back to talk about the history of Taiwan. Technically, I'm doing everything in alphabetical order, so it might not make entirely sense to go to Taiwan, but I figured talking about Taiwanese history is so interconnected with talking about the history of China itself, it kind of doesn't make sense to wait, so I just decided to skip ahead to it. And then after that, or maybe before that, I will talk about Zimbabwean political parties. I just want to make sure I release that episode before the next election in August 23rd. But yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this episode are The Boxers, China and the World, edited by Robert Bickers and R.J. Tiedemann, Ideology in the Xi Jinping Era by Carrie Brown and Una Alexandri Brenzny Chernikova, Jasby's recent series on modern Chinese history, The Cambridge Illustrated History by Patricia Berkeley Embry, PBS's 1996 documentary on the Tiananmen Square protest, and Wikipedia.